August 1944. General George S. Patton's Third Army is a steel spearhead, tearing across France at a speed thought impossible. But on August 19th, near the town of Argentan, the entire advance grinds to a halt. The famously aggressive American commander is there for an unscheduled, unrecorded meeting with French General Philippe Leclerc. Patton's orders from Supreme Command are unambiguous: drive east, trap the German army, and push for the Rhine. Yet this secret conversation is about a city the Allies have explicitly decided to bypass: Paris. The meeting is brief. The tanks pivot back towards Germany, but a forbidden word now hangs in the air, a word that could derail the entire Allied strategy. That single word, Paris, ignited a battle fought not with artillery, but with political will, back-channel maneuvers, and the threat of open mutiny. This is the story of the high-stakes struggle for the future of France, waged between the Allies themselves. We will reveal how one French general, Charles de Gaulle, commanding little more than a single armored division and the force of his own personality, challenged the entire Allied high command. And we will answer the central question: was General Patton, America's most aggressive commander, a secret accomplice in this political gambit, an act that directly defied the orders of the President of the United States? To understand this dangerous game of loyalties and ambitions, we must first understand the board, the players, and the rules they were all trying to break. To break the rules, you first have to understand them, and in the summer of 1944, the supreme rule was the Allied grand strategy. For General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, the war was a problem of brutal industrial logic. The plan, codenamed Overlord, was not about liberating territory for its own sake. Its single, overriding objective was the complete destruction of the German armed forces west of the Rhine. On Eisenhower's map, the path to victory was a massive, two-pronged envelopment. The main Allied armies would swing northeast, trapping the bulk of the German forces in a giant pincer movement, then drive hard for the German frontier. Paris was deliberately left outside this main axis of advance. It wasn't a strategic prize, it was a trap. Liberating the city meant inheriting the responsibility for its nearly 4 million inhabitants. Allied planners calculated this would require at least 4,000 tons of food and supplies per day. Every gallon of fuel, every truck, every soldier diverted to Paris was one less for the final push into Germany. In the cold calculus of war, Paris was a logistical black hole, a diversion that could stall the entire Allied war machine for weeks, giving the Germans precious time to regroup. But another war was being waged, far from the front lines, in the quiet offices of Washington and London. And in this war, Paris was the only objective that mattered. President Franklin D. Roosevelt held a deep personal distrust of Charles de Gaulle. He saw the leader of the Free French not as a heroic patriot, but as a pompous authoritarian figure with delusions of grandeur, a potential dictator in the making. Roosevelt refused to recognize de Gaulle's French Committee of National Liberation as the legitimate government in waiting. Instead, the American plan was to install AMGOT, the Allied Military Government of Occupied Territories. Upon liberation, American and British officers would take administrative control of France. They would appoint mayors, run utilities, and issue their own currency, a supplemental French franc printed in the United States. For de Gaulle, this was the ultimate insult. After 4 years of fighting to prove that France was an ally, not a defeated vassal, he now faced the prospect of his country being governed like a conquered enemy province. He understood a truth that transcended military logistics. Power in France did not flow from an election or a foreign decree. It flowed from Paris. Whoever liberated the capital and installed their authority in its government buildings would, in the eyes of the French people, become the legitimate ruler of the nation. The Allied military plan was set. De Gaulle's political authority was fragile, dependent on the goodwill of allies who did not trust him. It would take an unforeseen, explosive event to force Eisenhower's hand, and deep within the occupied city, the fuse for that explosion had just been lit. On August 19, 1944, that fuse ignited. The French resistance inside Paris, the FFI, launched a full-scale insurrection against the German garrison. Within hours, the city was a maze of barricades. The crack of rifles and the chatter of machine guns echoed through the grand boulevards. For the German commander, General von Choltitz, it was an unwelcome and bloody distraction. For the Allied High Command, it was a political firestorm. The news electrified one man above all others, General Philippe Leclerc, commander of the 2nd French Armored Division. His division, the pride of the Free French Army, was attached to the American 5th Corps under the command of Major General Leonard Giraud. Leclerc's orders were explicit. His tanks were to support the American advance east, away from Paris. But with his capital in flames and Frenchmen dying on the streets, the orders became intolerable. Leclerc drove to Giraud's headquarters. This was not a routine battlefield update. It was a confrontation. The French general, with cold formality, informed his American superior that the situation had changed. He then delivered a statement that shattered military protocol. It was not a request, it was a declaration. If a formal order to march on Paris was not given immediately, Leclerc stated that he would feel regretfully obliged to detach his division and proceed on his own. Authority. The threat was unmistakable: mutiny. In the midst of the most critical campaign of the war, a French general was threatening to break the chain of command and take his entire armored division rogue. The political problem of Paris had just become an acute military crisis. The decision was now far too big for a corps commander. It shot straight up the line, landing on the desk of one man, the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The threat of mutiny lands like a grenade on Eisenhower's strategic map. The Supreme Commander is now caught between his own military logic and the unraveling loyalties of his allies. But as he weighs the cost of diverting an army, another, more powerful player arrives to force his hand. On August 21st, Charles de Gaulle flies to France and secures a meeting with Eisenhower near Chartres. This is not a plea for French glory. De Gaulle, a master of political theater, delivers a cold, brutal analysis. He warns Eisenhower of two imminent and unacceptable disasters. The first is a bloodbath. If the Allies do nothing, the German garrison will inevitably crush the Parisian uprising street by street. The political fallout for the Allies, seen to be standing by while Paris burns, would be catastrophic. But it is his second point that strikes at the heart of Allied anxieties. The armed resistance in Paris, he explains, is led by Henri Roux-Tanguy, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War and a dedicated communist. De Gaulle lays out the stakes with chilling clarity. If the Allies do not liberate Paris, the communists will. They will seize the city, its government buildings, and its political narrative. They would become the liberators in the eyes of the people, potentially plunging France into a civil war between communist and non-communist factions, right in the middle of Eisenhower's rear area. The choice, de Gaulle implies, is no longer between bypassing Paris or liberating it. It is between an Allied liberation or a communist one. Eisenhower is trapped. His carefully calculated logistics are now pitted against the threat of a political implosion that could destabilize the entire Western Front. He still hesitates, arguing it's a military diversion he cannot afford. The pressure is immense. Back at the front, General Leclerc has run out of patience. He knows that moving his entire 2nd French Armored Division without orders is an unforgivable act of mutiny, an act that would end his career and disgrace the Free French cause. So he makes a subtler, more calculated move, an act of calibrated insubordination. He detaches a small advance reconnaissance party from his division, a unit known as La Nueve, commanded by Captain Raymond Drone. He gives them a simple, explosive order: probe towards Paris. It is an unambiguous violation of the American Fifth Corps' command, but one small enough to be potentially deniable, an overeager patrol that simply went too far. Leclerc is deliberately testing the limits of American authority, creating a fact on the ground that his superiors cannot ignore. A rogue French column is now racing towards the capital. The crisis is escalating by the hour. This brings us back to the question of General Patton. Was America's most aggressive general a secret party to this French defiance? The historical record is clear. There is no formal order, no written document, no proof of a conspiracy. But the circumstantial evidence is compelling. Patton's own diary entries from this period are filled with contempt for high command caution and a deep professional admiration for Leclerc's fighting spirit. He saw the French general as a kindred soul, a warrior chafing under the restraints of timid staff officers. The most critical piece of the puzzle, however, is not found in a diary, but in the fuel logs. Armored divisions are notoriously thirsty, and Leclerc's division had just been through weeks of heavy combat. By all rights, it should have been low on fuel, yet somehow it had enough for the 120-mile dash to Paris. The most credible interpretation is not a grand political plot, but something more subtle, a form of professional courtesy between soldiers. Historians suggest that Patton's supply officers, with his tacit approval, simply lost the paperwork, or unofficially prioritized Leclerc's fuel requests. It was a field commander bending the rules for another commander he respected, a quiet act of logistical sabotage to enable a military objective he personally supported. While the Allies wrestle with their loyalties, the German commander in Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, faces his own crisis of conscience. He has just received a direct and furious order from Hitler himself, via telegram. Paris must not fall into the enemy's hand except as a field of ruins. The Führer demands the city's bridges, monuments, and infrastructure be wired for demolition and utterly destroyed. But von Choltitz is a professional officer from a Prussian military family, not a Nazi fanatic. He surveys his garrison of 20,000 men, many of them low-quality administrative troops, and recognizes the military situation is hopeless. He sees the destruction of a city he considers a jewel of European culture as a pointless act of vandalism, an order that would forever stain the honor of the German army. So he begins to play his own dangerous game. He initiates secret negotiations for a fragile ceasefire with the resistance, using the Swedish consul Raoul Nordling as an intermediary. Von Choltitz's motive is not to save Paris for the French, it is to save his own men. He is buying time, not to fight, but to surrender his command to a regular Allied army, rather than see his soldiers torn apart by a chaotic partisan mob. This act of defiance, this self-interested delay, is a critical unintended gift. It keeps Paris from destroying itself from within, even as the forces to liberate it are tearing the Allied command apart from without. With a French division now officially rogue, a German general secretly defying Hitler, and a city on the verge of either a communist takeover or total destruction, Eisenhower's carefully laid strategic plans are collapsing. He can no longer afford to wait. On August 22nd, the decision lands. Dwight Eisenhower, cornered by events, finally breaks with his own strategy. He will send troops to Paris. But it is not a surrender to de Gaulle's political maneuvering or Leclerc's insubordination. It is a surrender to cold, hard logic. The alternative outcomes are simply too catastrophic to contemplate. A rogue French division shattering the Allied coalition, a communist-led uprising seizing the French capital, a bloody massacre of the resistance that would stain the Allied cause forever. Eisenhower chooses the least bad option. He authorizes the advance, but the order comes with a crucial, non-negotiable condition. Leclerc's 2nd French Armored will not go alone. The American 4th Infantry Division, under Major General Raymond Barton, will advance alongside them. This is not just military reinforcement, it is a powerful political statement. The liberation of Paris will be a joint Allied operation, a clear signal to de Gaulle that he is a partner in a coalition, not its sole beneficiary. The question is no longer if the Allies will go to Paris, but how they will go, and who will ultimately claim the victory. The order is given. The race for Paris is officially on. But reaching the city is one thing, claiming its soul is another. The advance is no victory lap. On the city's outskirts, remnants of the German garrison fight with desperate tenacity. Then, through the chaos on the evening of August 24th, a single column breaks through. It is the 9th Company of Leclerc's division, La Nueve, a unit comprised almost entirely of veteran Spanish Republicans who had been fighting fascists since the Spanish Civil War. Their half-tracks, bearing the names of battles like Guadalajara and Teruel, are the first Allied armor to reach the heart of the city, the Hôtel de Ville. The next morning, August 25th, the main forces of the French 2nd Armored and the American 4th Infantry pour into the capital. At the Hotel Meurice, General von Choltitz formally surrenders. He pointedly hands his sidearm to General Leclerc, a regular officer, deliberately bypassing the resistance leaders waiting to claim their prize. But the final move in this complex game belongs to Charles de Gaulle. Arriving in the newly freed city, he ignores the Allied military commanders. He snubs the Resistance Council waiting for him at the Hôtel de Ville. Instead, he stages the ultimate act of political theater. He walks down the entire length of the Champs-Élysées, surrounded by a sea of ecstatic Parisians. This is not a military review. It is a physical, symbolic claiming of the capital, a broadcast to the world that France was not merely liberated, it was sovereign, and he was its leader. The city was free. The tricolor flew over Notre Dame. But what did this dramatic, improvised liberation actually mean for the war, for France, and for the alliance that won it? And in that act, the true meaning of the liberation becomes clear. We return to that strange, unrecorded meeting near Argentan. Was General Patton a secret accomplice? The evidence reveals not a conspiracy, but something more fundamental. A moment of quiet recognition between two field commanders. They saw a truth the grand strategists in their headquarters had tried to ignore, that on the ground, political will can be as powerful as an armored division. The fuel that flowed to Leclerc's tanks was not an act of treason. It was a pragmatic acknowledgement that the French mission had become politically unstoppable. Ultimately, the liberation of Paris was not a military objective. It was a political victory, forced upon a reluctant Eisenhower by Charles de Gaulle's iron will and his generals' calculated brinkmanship. In forcing the Supreme Commander's hand, de Gaulle dismantled Roosevelt's plan for an Allied military government, secured his own legitimacy, and ensured that France would be governed by the French. This entire episode reveals a fundamental and often overlooked truth about coalition warfare. For the war in Europe was a battle of armies, a brutal contest of logistics and firepower. But the war for the soul of France was a battle of ideas, won by the one man who understood that a symbol, broadcast to the world, can be more powerful than a supply line.